The kettle has been boiling long enough that the sound has stopped being sharp. It has softened into a steady presence, the kind you only notice once you decide to listen. The small kitchen is dim, the window reflecting the room back onto itself, and the chair across the table sits slightly askew, as though it was moved and never quite returned to its place. The young man is already speaking when the older man settles into his seat. He does not begin at the beginning. He starts somewhere in the middle, as people often do when they are tired of explaining themselves. He talks about effort, about trying to do things correctly, about the strange feeling that no matter how much he adjusts, something is always off. He describes the exhaustion of constantly checking himself, his words, his reactions, wondering how they land. The older man listens without interruption. His hands rest on the table. His attention does not drift. When the kettle is finally turned off, the sudden quiet feels louder than the sound that came before it. The young man exhales and continues, his voice slower now. He talks about how approval never seems to last. Compliments fade quickly. Criticism lingers. Even on good days, there is a sense that something could collapse at any moment. He wonders aloud if there is something fundamentally lacking in him, some flaw that effort alone cannot correct. The older man pours hot water into 2 cups, careful, unhurried. He slides one across the table and waits until the young man takes it before speaking. He does not reassure him. He does not disagree. He asks a question instead, quietly, as though it has been waiting its turn. When you make a choice, he asks, whose satisfaction are you hoping for? The young man frowns. The question feels too simple, almost naive. He answers without thinking. Everyone's, he says. Parents. Colleagues. Friends. People in general. He gestures vaguely, as though the audience is everywhere. The list grows as he speaks, until it becomes unwieldy, until it begins to sound impossible even to him. The older man nods, not approvingly, but as if something has been confirmed. He speaks then about a life lived under observation. About how, when a person believes they are always being evaluated, they stop acting and start performing. Each choice is measured not by sincerity, but by safety. Over time, the performance becomes automatic. It feels responsible. It feels mature. And yet, beneath it, there is a constant tension, a vigilance that never rests. The young man shifts in his chair. He says that wanting to be liked is normal. That avoiding conflict is reasonable. The older man agrees. He does not challenge the instinct. He questions the cost of obeying it without limit. He describes how people gradually trade honesty for acceptance. How they begin to anticipate disappointment before it occurs, reshaping themselves to prevent it. The tragedy, he says, is not that this fails. Often, it works. People are pleased. Harmony is maintained. But the person doing the pleasing slowly disappears from their own life. The light outside the window dims further. The room grows quieter. The young man listens, something tightening and loosening at the same time. The older man speaks next about the past, but not in the way the young man expects. He does not ask about childhood or wounds or defining moments. He speaks instead about interpretation. About how 2 people can carry the same experience and arrive at entirely different lives, depending on what meaning they assign to it. The past, he says, explains nothing on its own. It is given meaning in the present. This unsettles the young man. He says it sounds like denying reality. Like ignoring pain. The older man shakes his head. He says pain is real. What is optional is the role it plays. A memory can become an explanation, a justification, or a limitation, depending on what purpose it serves. The young man feels resistance rise. He has relied on explanations for a long time. They have helped him understand himself. They have also kept him from moving. This contradiction sits uncomfortably between them. The older man does not resolve it. He speaks instead of courage, but not as bravery or defiance. He describes courage as the willingness to stand by one's choices without asking for permission. The willingness to accept misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. The willingness to be disliked when honesty demands it. The young man asks what happens then. What happens when people pull away? When relationships strain? The older man does not soften his answer. He says some relationships will change. Some will end. But relationships that depend on self-erasure were never stable to begin with. Silence settles again, heavier now, but not empty. The young man does not feel relieved. He feels exposed, as though a structure he leaned on has been quietly removed. The older man seems to sense this. He says that freedom rarely feels comforting at first. It feels like uncertainty. It feels like standing without instructions. And it requires something many people avoid for as long as possible. Responsibility. The conversation slows after that. There is no conclusion, no reassurance. Only the sense that something has been set in motion. When the young man stands to leave, the evening has fully arrived. He pauses at the door, unsure what to say, then offers a small nod instead. The older man returns it, calm and unchanged, as though this meeting was never meant to provide answers, only to begin a different way of looking. The door closes. The cups sit cooling on the table. And somewhere between what was said and what was left unsaid, the fear of being disliked has been named, quietly, for the first time. The street outside feels wider than usual. The young man walks without a clear destination in mind, letting his steps decide the pace. The city moves around him in its familiar rhythm, lights changing, doors opening and closing, fragments of conversation drifting past. Normally, his attention would be turned inward, replaying what was said, checking for mistakes. Tonight, the thoughts come more slowly, as though they are waiting to see where he is going before following. At home, he sits on the edge of his bed, still wearing his jacket. He stares at nothing in particular and realizes that the conversation has left him without a conclusion. No instruction. No reassurance. Just a question that refuses to settle. Whose satisfaction am I living for? The words do not repeat loudly. They remain steady, like a low hum beneath everything else. The next morning unfolds as usual. He wakes, prepares for the day, joins the quiet flow of people heading somewhere important. Yet something in him has shifted just enough to make the familiar feel slightly unstable. He notices how often his body reacts before his mind does. The way his shoulders tense when someone approaches with authority. The way his voice adjusts automatically, becoming agreeable before he has decided what he actually thinks. At work, a meeting begins the way it always does. Ideas are shared, refined, softened. When a colleague proposes something that contradicts his own thinking, his instinct is immediate. He prepares to step back, to yield gracefully, to preserve the atmosphere. The movement begins inside him before he is aware of it. Then it pauses. Not because he feels confident, but because he notices the pause itself. The space between reaction and response feels unfamiliar. Slightly uncomfortable. He uses it anyway. He speaks carefully, without defensiveness. He explains his reasoning without apology. The room does not react dramatically. A few people listen. One disagrees. Another asks a question. The conversation shifts and moves on. Nothing collapses. When the meeting ends, he feels a dull fatigue, as though he has carried something heavier than usual. Alongside it is a quiet sense of solidity. Throughout the day, similar moments appear. Small, ordinary decisions that once passed unnoticed now feel deliberate. He realizes how often he has been shaping himself around imagined reactions. Not actual disapproval, but anticipated disapproval. He has been negotiating with ghosts. When he meets the older man again, the setting is quieter, less contained. They sit where conversations can drift without interruption. The young man speaks about these small changes, about the discomfort that follows them. He admits that even when nothing goes wrong, he waits for something to go wrong later. As though honesty creates a debt that must eventually be collected. The older man listens, then speaks about tasks. He explains that many people spend their lives trying to complete tasks that do not belong to them. They try to manage how others feel. They try to control how they are perceived. They attempt to prevent disappointment before it arises. This effort, he says, creates endless strain. He draws a distinction without dramatizing it. One's task is to speak honestly, to act responsibly, to choose deliberately. Another person's task is to respond as they will. Confusing the two leads to anxiety. Separating them leads to clarity. The young man resists this idea immediately. He says that relationships require sensitivity. That words have consequences. The older man agrees. He says responsibility does not disappear when tasks are separated. What disappears is the illusion of control. He explains that a person can act with care and still be disliked. That misunderstanding is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of difference. To demand universal approval is to demand the impossible, and to punish oneself for not achieving it. The young man feels something shift as he listens. He realizes how much of his behavior has been driven by the hope that if he explains himself well enough, adjusts carefully enough, he can avoid rejection altogether. The older man suggests that this hope is not optimism, but fear in disguise. They speak next about purpose, not as destiny, but as direction. The older man says that people often ask why they are the way they are, searching backward for causes. A more revealing question, he suggests, is what they are trying to achieve by remaining that way. Behaviors that appear self-defeating often serve hidden purposes, such as avoiding responsibility, preventing failure, or maintaining a familiar identity. This idea lands heavily. The young man thinks of how often he has described himself as cautious, realistic, not ready. He sees now how these descriptions have protected him from risk. They have also protected him from change. The older man does not accuse him of avoidance. He simply says that once a purpose is recognized, it can be reconsidered. What was once necessary may no longer be. When they part, the young man feels unsettled rather than inspired. There is no sense of progress, only exposure. He is becoming aware of patterns that once operated quietly. Awareness brings no immediate relief. It brings responsibility. That night, sleep comes unevenly. His mind returns again and again to moments where he chose safety over honesty. He does not judge himself for them. He simply sees them more clearly. And in that clarity, something new begins to form. Not confidence. Not certainty. But the beginning of choice. By morning, nothing is resolved. The world remains demanding. Expectations remain in place. Yet the young man moves through the day with a subtle difference. He is no longer only reacting. He is beginning, slowly, to participate. The change does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, the way a new habit forms before it is named. The young man begins to notice how often his thoughts run ahead of him, predicting reactions, rehearsing defenses, preparing exits. This inner movement has always felt necessary, even protective. Now it feels visible, like machinery he has been carrying without ever examining. During a visit home, the familiar patterns return almost immediately. His parents speak with concern wrapped carefully in advice. They ask about plans, stability, progress. He answers as he always has, with measured reassurance, with words chosen to calm rather than reveal. Halfway through a sentence, he stops. The pause is brief, but it changes the room. He finishes his thought differently. He says he is still uncertain. He says he is exploring. He does not promise outcomes he cannot guarantee. The air tightens. His parents exchange a glance. No one raises their voice. No one accuses. The discomfort sits openly between them. On the way home, the unease follows him. He feels the old guilt, the familiar sense that he has failed to fulfill an expectation. Alongside it is something else, quieter but steadier. He did not abandon himself to restore balance. The cost is real. So is the relief. When he meets the older man again, he speaks about this moment. About the tension that arose not from conflict, but from refusing to smooth things over. The older man listens, then speaks about belonging. He says many people confuse belonging with being liked. They believe acceptance must be earned through agreement, through accommodation, through careful adjustment. But belonging, he says, is not secured by compliance. It comes from participation as oneself, even when that self causes friction. He describes environments that appear peaceful because nothing is challenged. In such places, harmony is maintained through silence. People learn what not to say, what not to want, what not to question. Over time, the absence of conflict begins to feel like safety, even as something vital is missing. The young man recognizes this immediately. He has lived inside that quiet. He has mistaken it for maturity. The older man speaks then about equality, not as sameness, but as orientation. He explains that people often relate to others from positions of superiority or inferiority. Both distort connection. One seeks control. The other seeks permission. Neither allows genuine meeting. To see others as equals, he says, is to abandon comparison. It is to speak without needing to impress or diminish oneself. It is to allow difference without turning it into hierarchy. This unsettles the young man more than he expects. He realizes how often his self-criticism has served as a disguise for comparison. By lowering himself, he believed he was being humble. In truth, he was still measuring. They speak of contribution, not as achievement, but as presence. The older man says meaning does not come from being admired. It comes from being useful in ordinary ways. When a person feels they contribute, even modestly, their sense of worth stabilizes. It no longer depends on constant evaluation. The young man thinks of moments when he felt unexpectedly calm. Times when he helped without being noticed. When he acted without anticipating response. These moments stand out now, not as accomplishments, but as relief. In the days that follow, he begins to experiment. He offers help without announcing it. He shares opinions without excessive cushioning. He allows awkwardness to linger instead of rushing to dissolve it. Each time, the discomfort rises, peaks, then fades. The feared consequences rarely arrive. When they do, they are manageable. He begins to see how much of his suffering came not from rejection itself, but from the effort to prevent it. The vigilance. The anticipation. The constant self-monitoring. Letting go does not make life easier. It makes it simpler. One evening, walking home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, he notices that he is no longer asking in every moment whether he is liked. The question still appears, but it no longer dominates. In its place is another, quieter one, asking whether he is acting honestly. The answer is not always yes. He still hesitates. He still retreats at times. But the direction has shifted. He is no longer standing still, waiting for approval to move. He is moving, imperfectly, into a life that belongs to him. What surprises him most is how ordinary the change feels once it begins. There is no moment where he wakes up different. No clear line between before and after. The same routines continue. The same people occupy his days. Yet something inside those routines has shifted, like a weight redistributed rather than removed. He notices it first in small refusals. Not dramatic ones. Quiet ones. A task offered that does not align with his capacity. A request that assumes his compliance. In the past, he would have agreed automatically, then carried the resentment silently. Now, he pauses. He considers what belongs to him and what does not. When he speaks, his voice is steady, not defensive. He explains his limits and suggests an alternative. The response is not immediate approval. There is a moment of surprise, then recalibration. The conversation continues. When it ends, he feels exposed, as though he has stepped into colder air. But he also feels intact. Nothing inside him has been traded away. When he brings this to the older man does not praise him. He speaks instead about freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from the invisible trial many people live under. He describes how people behave as though they must constantly prove their worth, as though every interaction is evidence for or against them. Living this way, he says, leaves no room to rest. Even success becomes fragile, because it must be defended. Even approval becomes temporary, because it can always be withdrawn. The young man listens and recognizes himself. He sees how often he has lived one step ahead of judgment, shaping his actions to avoid an imagined verdict. The older man says that freedom begins when a person decides they no longer need to be acquitted. They speak about confidence, and the young man admits that he still does not feel it. The older man nods. He says confidence is often misunderstood as a feeling that arrives before action. In reality, it is built afterward. It forms slowly, through repeated experiences of acting honestly and surviving the outcome. Then they speak about relationships. The young man admits his fear that living more openly will cost him connection. The older man does not deny it. He says some relationships rely on imbalance, on one person bending more than the other. When that bending stops, the structure changes. This knowledge carries a quiet grief. The young man thinks of friendships sustained by his flexibility, his silence, his willingness to adapt. He wonders who will remain if he stops doing this. The older man says that authenticity does not destroy relationships. It reveals which ones are real. As weeks pass, the young man becomes more attentive to his internal signals. Irritation no longer feels like a personal flaw to suppress immediately. He begins to ask what it is pointing to. A boundary crossed. An expectation left unspoken. He sees that anger, when examined rather than acted out, often carries useful information. A friend cancels plans again at the last moment. The familiar disappointment rises. In the past, he would have minimized it, assuring the friend it was fine while quietly resenting the pattern. This time, he speaks about it calmly. The conversation is awkward. There is defensiveness, then reflection. The pattern does not disappear completely, but it shifts. More importantly, he does not leave the exchange feeling diminished. When he speaks with the older man about responsibility, the older man clarifies something the young man has been circling. Responsibility, he says, does not mean controlling outcomes. It means acknowledging one's role in choices. Blaming circumstances may soothe temporarily, but it keeps a person passive. Accepting responsibility is heavier, but it restores agency. The young man recognizes how often he has hidden behind explanations. His upbringing. His personality. His circumstances. These explanations were not untrue. But they became places to stop. Accepting responsibility feels less comfortable, but more honest. They speak about happiness then, cautiously. The older man says happiness is not something that can be pursued directly. It emerges as a side effect of alignment. When a person lives according to their values rather than in reaction to others, moments of quiet satisfaction appear on their own. The young man does not feel happy in a dramatic sense. He feels more awake, more accountable. And in between the discomfort, there are brief moments of steadiness. Moments where he feels located in his own life rather than hovering around it. One evening, he sits alone as the city lights begin to appear one by one. He thinks about the courage he has been practicing. How unremarkable it looks from the outside. No declarations. No confrontations. Just the steady refusal to disappear. He understands now that being disliked is not a catastrophe. It is a signal that he has stepped out of performance. What replaces it is not ease, but integrity. And for the first time, that feels like enough to continue. Time begins to stretch in a different way. The days no longer feel like a series of hurdles to clear. They feel more like terrain to move across, uneven but navigable. The young man still experiences doubt, still hesitates, still feels the pull of old habits. What has changed is not the presence of fear, but its authority. He notices this during a moment at work when an idea he believes in is dismissed quickly. The familiar heat rises in his chest, the reflexive urge to interpret the dismissal as proof of his inadequacy. For a few seconds, the old story nearly takes hold. Then something interrupts it. He sees the reaction for what it is, a difference in perspective, a matter of timing, a limitation that may have nothing to do with him at all. He does not argue. He does not retreat. He states his position once more, calmly, then allows the discussion to move on. Later, as he walks home, he realizes that the sting has already begun to fade. In the past, it would have lingered for hours, replayed and refined into self-criticism. Now, it passes through him without settling. When he meets the older man again, he speaks about this change with uncertainty, as though he does not quite trust it yet. The older man listens and then speaks about self-acceptance. Not as indulgence, not as resignation, but as accuracy. He says that many people believe they must become worthy before they are allowed to accept themselves. They imagine a future version of who they should be, more disciplined, more impressive, more complete. Acceptance is postponed until that version is achieved. In the meantime, the present self is treated as something to be tolerated or corrected. The older man suggests that this posture creates endless tension. Growth built on rejection of the self is unstable. It may produce movement, but it rarely produces peace. Acceptance, he says, is not the end of effort. It is the beginning of honest effort. The young man resists this idea at first. He worries that accepting himself will drain his motivation. That without self-criticism, he will lose direction. The older man clarifies gently. Self-criticism attacks identity. Responsibility addresses behavior. One weakens. The other strengthens. This distinction lingers with the young man. He begins to notice how often his inner voice has been cruel in the name of improvement. He has believed that severity was necessary to stay disciplined. He sees now how much energy that severity has consumed. As weeks pass, he experiments with a different tone toward himself. When he falls short, he acknowledges it without condemnation. When he succeeds, he notices it without clinging. The change is subtle, but the effect is cumulative. He feels less divided, less at war with himself. The older man speaks next about trust, not as certainty, but as posture. He explains that many people attempt to eliminate risk before acting. They wait until trust feels safe. Until outcomes are predictable. Until vulnerability seems justified. Yet trust, he says, is not a reward given after safety is guaranteed. It is a stance taken in the absence of guarantees. This feels unsettling. The young man has learned to protect himself carefully. He has measured his openness, shared selectively, withheld where he sensed danger. The older man does not tell him to abandon boundaries. He tells him to recognize that complete safety has never existed. Avoiding risk entirely has only limited his life. In the days that follow, the young man tests this carefully. He speaks honestly about something that matters to him, without cushioning it excessively. He asks for help when he needs it. He allows appreciation to be expressed without deflecting it. The responses are mixed. Some moments are warm. Others are awkward. None are devastating. Gradually, he feels less like a visitor in his own life. His attention shifts outward, toward what he is doing rather than how it appears. He notices details he once missed, the rhythm of conversations, the quiet satisfaction of completing something without needing it to be seen. One evening, he reflects on how dominant the fear of being disliked once was. It has not disappeared. It still appears in moments of uncertainty. But it no longer governs him. It has become one voice among many, not the final authority. He understands now that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to move with fear present, without surrendering direction. And in practicing this, imperfectly and repeatedly, he has begun to stand on his own ground. The realization does not arrive with celebration. It arrives quietly, like the steady sense that he is no longer waiting for permission to live. He begins to hear certain phrases more clearly now, as though they have been turned up in the background of everyday life. What people expect. What everyone thinks. What you're supposed to do. These words pass casually through conversations, spoken without ownership, as if they describe natural laws rather than shared assumptions. He has used them himself for years. Only now does he notice how often they replace genuine choice. One afternoon, during a conversation that drifts toward opinion and uncertainty, someone starts to speak, then stops, dismissing their own thought with a shrug. The young man recognizes the movement instantly. The retreat disguised as modesty. Without planning to, he asks them to continue. His tone is simple. Interested. The person does, surprised at first, then more freely. The idea is not extraordinary, but it is treated as real. Something shifts in the room. Later, he reflects on how rarely people are invited to take up space without justification. How often they are trained to shrink preemptively, to avoid the possibility of disapproval. The older man's voice returns to him, not as instruction, but as orientation. When they meet again, the conversation turns toward how people are taught to live. Not formally, not through lessons, but through atmosphere. The older man speaks about systems that rely on comparison and fear. From an early age, people learn to rank themselves, to measure worth through performance, to believe value is something assigned externally and revoked easily. The young man listens, thinking of classrooms, evaluations, subtle praise, and quiet disappointment. He sees now how deeply these patterns settled into him, shaping not only ambition, but self-perception. Praise once felt like relief. Criticism felt like threat. Both kept him dependent. The older man speaks again of contribution, returning to it as though it were central. He says that a sense of contribution does not come from being exceptional. It comes from being engaged. When a person feels useful, even in ordinary ways, their sense of worth stabilizes. They stop asking whether they matter, because they are already participating. This idea resonates differently now. The young man has begun to feel it himself. In moments when he helps without being noticed. When he listens without preparing a response. When he does something simply because it needs doing. These moments do not inflate him. They steady him. The older man contrasts this with recognition, which he describes as unstable by nature. Recognition depends on comparison. Someone must be above, someone below. Even those who receive it must continue performing to keep it. Contribution, by contrast, does not require anyone to lose. The young man reflects on how often he has measured himself against others, using their success as evidence of his own inadequacy. He sees now how this habit has kept him restless and resentful. Letting go of comparison does not happen instantly, but awareness weakens its grip. He notices when it arises and allows it to pass without argument. They speak then about the past, not as something to overcome, but as something to reframe. The older man says the past does not dictate direction unless it is given authority. A memory is not an order. It becomes limiting only when it is treated as a command rather than information. The young man thinks of moments he has replayed endlessly, using them as proof of who he is. He begins to see how selectively he has remembered, how certain experiences were elevated while others were ignored. The past has not lied to him. He has simply listened to only part of it. As days pass, he notices a growing patience in himself. When mistakes occur, he addresses them without spiraling. When conflict appears, he stays present rather than preparing escape. The discomfort still arises, but it no longer overwhelms him. It moves through him and leaves him standing. One evening, he sits with a friend who is struggling, listening without interrupting or fixing. The friend speaks freely, unburdening themselves. When they finish, they thank him, saying it helped simply to be heard. The young man feels a quiet sense of contribution, modest and deeply grounding. He realizes then that the courage he has been practicing is not about confrontation. It is about sincerity. About showing up without armor. Without calculation. Without the need to manage outcomes. As night settles, he reflects on how much has changed without spectacle. He has not become fearless. He has not resolved every doubt. But he has stopped treating fear as an authority. He has stopped asking it for permission. In the space created by that decision, his life continues. Ordinary. Imperfect. And increasingly his own. The shift becomes noticeable in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone else. It shows up not as confidence, but as a lack of urgency. He no longer feels compelled to fill every pause, to soften every edge, to smooth every surface before someone else notices it. The absence of that pressure feels unfamiliar at first, like walking without a brace he has worn for years. At a small gathering, someone asks him what he plans to do next with his life. The question lands the way it always has, but it does not hook into him the same way. He does not search for a version of the answer that will reassure the room. He says, simply, that he is still finding his direction. He lets the statement stand without apology. There is a brief silence. Someone nods. Another person changes the subject. Nothing fractures. Later, he realizes how much effort he once spent preventing moments like this, moments that turned out to be ordinary rather than dangerous. When he meets the older man again, their conversation turns toward happiness, though not as an emotion to pursue. The older man speaks of happiness as a stance, something that emerges when a person lives in alignment rather than anticipation. Many people, he says, postpone happiness until conditions are met. Until success arrives. Until certainty is achieved. Until approval is secured. In doing so, they turn their present lives into waiting rooms. The young man feels the weight of that image. He recognizes how often he treated his own life as something preliminary, something to endure until it could properly begin. He sees now how that posture drained meaning from moments that were never meant to be temporary. The older man says happiness appears not when life becomes easy, but when resistance softens. When a person stops fighting what is already happening and begins responding honestly to it. Happiness, in this sense, is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is noticed only in hindsight, when the struggle to be someone else loosens. There is a setback soon after. A conversation goes poorly. A misunderstanding lingers. Old doubts surface with familiar voices, suggesting that this path leads to isolation. He feels the pull to retreat, to repair the situation by yielding. This time, he does not force himself to be brave. He does not perform courage. He waits. He allows the discomfort to exist without immediately acting on it. The feeling crests, then recedes. What remains is clarity. He sees that the fear was loud, but temporary. His capacity to remain present was quieter, but more enduring. When he speaks with the older man about this, the older man explains that courage is not a permanent state. It is a choice that must be renewed repeatedly. There will always be moments when conformity feels safer than sincerity. The work is not eliminating those moments, but recognizing them without surrender. They speak about self-reliance, not as isolation, but as trust. Trust in one's ability to face consequences without collapsing. A person who trusts themselves does not need guarantees. They know they can respond to whatever follows. This trust is not built through affirmation, but through experience. The young man sees how each small act of honesty has strengthened this trust. Each time he has survived discomfort, something has been proven. Not that he is invulnerable, but that he is capable. As months pass, his relationships continue to shift. Some deepen, nourished by the new clarity. Others loosen, no longer sustained by his accommodation. A few fade without drama. He allows this without clinging. He understands now that change is not betrayal. It is movement. One evening, he sits alone in a familiar cafe, watching people pass by the window. He feels a sense of belonging that does not depend on inclusion. He belongs simply by being present, by participating in the shared human experience of uncertainty and effort. He thinks back to the first conversation, to the kettle boiling unnoticed, to the question that disrupted his assumptions. He sees now that nothing was taken from him. What was removed was an illusion, the belief that safety could be secured through constant approval. In its place is something less predictable but more honest. A life shaped by choice rather than fear. A willingness to be disliked in order to remain sincere. The realization settles gently. There is no sense of arrival. Only the understanding that this way of living is not a destination, but a practice. One that unfolds quietly, day by day, in moments that no longer feel small. There is a morning when he realizes he has left the house without rehearsing a single conversation. The awareness comes later, while he is already moving through the day, and it surprises him with its simplicity. Nothing dramatic has replaced the habit. It has simply loosened, like a knot worked free by patience rather than force. At work, a new project begins under unclear conditions. Roles overlap. Expectations shift. In the past, this ambiguity would have unsettled him deeply. He would have watched others closely, adjusting his behavior to match whatever seemed safest. Now, he notices the uncertainty without assigning it meaning. He focuses on what he can do, on what needs attention, and allows the rest to remain unresolved. Feedback comes sporadically. Sometimes it is clear. Sometimes it is absent. He listens when it arrives and continues when it does not. He no longer treats silence as condemnation. It is simply silence. When he speaks with the older man again, the conversation turns toward consistency. Not intensity, not boldness, but the quiet courage of acting according to one's values even when no one is watching. The older man says that many people mistake courage for dramatic moments, when in reality it is shaped through repetition. Through choosing sincerity again and again in ordinary situations. The young man recognizes this immediately. The most difficult moments have not been confrontations. They have been everyday choices. Whether to speak plainly. Whether to say no without explanation. Whether to let discomfort remain instead of rushing to erase it. There is a conversation with a close friend that tests this steadiness. The friend speaks with frustration, attributing blame quickly, expecting agreement. The young man listens carefully. He acknowledges what is his to acknowledge and leaves the rest untouched. The air grows tense. The conversation ends without resolution. Days pass. The young man resists the urge to revisit the exchange in his mind, to rewrite it into something smoother. When the friend reaches out again, the tone has changed. There is less accusation, more reflection. He understands then that by not collapsing under misplaced responsibility, he allowed the relationship to recalibrate rather than fracture. The older man speaks about boundaries as clarity rather than defense. A boundary, he says, is simply an acknowledgement of where one person ends and another begins. Without it, responsibility blurs and resentment grows. With it, relationships are allowed to adjust honestly. The young man feels the truth of this in his own experience. Each boundary he honors reduces an internal conflict he did not know he was carrying. He feels less divided, less scattered across the expectations of others. He notices how rarely he now asks whether he is living correctly. That question once followed him everywhere. It has been replaced by something quieter, asking whether he is acting sincerely in this moment. When the answer is no, he adjusts without punishment. When the answer is yes, he continues without needing reinforcement. One evening, walking through a familiar neighborhood, he is struck by how unchanged everything appears. The same streets. The same buildings. The same passing faces. Yet his experience of them is different. He no longer feels as though he is being evaluated by an invisible standard. He feels involved, imperfectly and fully. He understands now that the courage to be disliked is not about rejecting others. It is about releasing the need to be defined by their reactions. It is about choosing presence over performance, contribution over comparison. There is no sense of arrival. No final clarity that promises permanence. What exists instead is continuity. A way of moving through life that remains steady even when it is uncomfortable. A trust in himself that grows not from certainty, but from lived experience. As night settles, he reflects not on how far he has come, but on how differently he now stands where he is. The world has not softened. Expectations have not disappeared. What has changed is his relationship to them. He no longer lives as though he must earn his right to exist. He exists, and from that place, he chooses how to live. There is an afternoon when he finds himself doing nothing at all. He sits near the window, light moving slowly across the floor, the city murmuring at a distance. Once, stillness like this would have made him uneasy. It would have felt unproductive, like evidence of falling behind. Now it feels neutral, almost kind. Nothing is demanded of him in this moment, and he does not demand anything of himself. He notices how rarely his thoughts turn toward comparison. The habit has not vanished completely, but it no longer takes over. When it appears, it feels thinner, easier to recognize as an old reflex rather than a truth. He does not argue with it. He lets it pass, the way one lets a familiar sound fade into the background. When he meets the older man again, their conversation drifts toward meaning. Not purpose in a grand sense, not destiny or calling, but meaning as something that emerges through engagement. The older man speaks of how people often search for meaning as if it were hidden somewhere ahead of them, waiting to be discovered. In doing so, they miss the way meaning forms quietly through what they choose to do and how they choose to relate. Meaning, he says, is not assigned. It is generated. It grows through participation, through showing up to life as it is rather than postponing it until conditions improve. The young man recognizes how often he once treated his life as something preliminary. He waited for clarity before acting, for confidence before committing, for approval before moving. In that waiting, much of life slipped by unnoticed. He sees now that certainty was never meant to arrive first. The older man speaks gently about loneliness. Not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a condition to be acknowledged. Even in closeness, even in love, there remains a distance that cannot be fully closed. Many people try to eliminate this by merging with others, by surrendering individuality in exchange for connection. The result, he says, is deeper isolation, because the self that disappears cannot truly be met. This settles heavily with the young man. He thinks of relationships where he slowly erased himself, believing it was the price of closeness. He understands now that connection without separation is not connection at all. It is avoidance. As weeks turn into months, he becomes more comfortable with solitude. Not as absence, but as companionship with himself. He walks without distraction. He reads without urgency. He listens to music without imagining how it might look from the outside. These moments feel modest, but they carry a quiet fullness. There is a conflict that tests this steadiness. A misunderstanding at work escalates, and criticism lands that feels unfair. The old urge to defend himself aggressively appears, followed by the urge to withdraw completely. Instead, he responds calmly, stating his perspective without accusation, then steps back. He allows the situation to unfold. The outcome is imperfect. Some tension remains. But he does not lose himself to it. He goes home that evening tired but intact. He understands then that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. When he speaks with the older man about this, the older man says maturity is often misunderstood as control. In reality, it is tolerance. The ability to tolerate ambiguity, discomfort, and imperfection without collapsing or hardening. This tolerance creates space, both within oneself and with others. The young man sees how this has changed his interactions. He listens more openly. He reacts less defensively. He no longer feels responsible for managing everyone's emotions. In releasing that burden, he becomes more available, not less. One evening, he is invited into a conversation he once would have avoided. He shares his perspective, knowing it may not be welcomed. Some agree. Some do not. The conversation moves on. He feels a quiet satisfaction, not because he was affirmed, but because he was present. He understands now that the courage to be disliked is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of trust. Trust in his ability to remain whole even when others disagree. Trust in life to continue unfolding even when approval is absent. As night settles, he notices how little mental noise follows him into sleep. There is nothing he needs to replay, nothing he needs to correct. The questions that remain feel open rather than heavy. And in that openness, he senses a life that is not perfect or certain, but deeply, quietly his. There comes a time when he can no longer pinpoint when the tension loosened. It did not leave suddenly. It thinned, gradually, like fog lifting without announcement. One day he notices that his shoulders no longer tighten instinctively when someone speaks with authority. Another day he realizes that disagreement no longer feels like a personal threat. These realizations arrive quietly, without pride or relief. They are simply noticed and absorbed. He becomes more attentive to cause and effect, not in a moral sense, but in a lived one. When he acts from fear, something contracts. When he acts from sincerity, even when the outcome is uncomfortable, something opens. The pattern repeats often enough that it no longer feels abstract. It feels reliable. He does not always choose well, but he now understands what he is choosing between. When he meets the older man again, their conversation turns toward freedom and responsibility, not as separate ideas, but as one. The older man speaks of how many people desire freedom without consequence. They want choice without cost, independence without discomfort. This, he says, is another way of avoiding life. To choose one's own path is to accept what follows without resentment. The weight of responsibility is real, but so is the steadiness it brings. Without it, a person remains dependent on circumstance, always reacting, never standing. The older man returns to the idea of tasks. Some tasks belong to the self. Others belong to others. Confusion arises when these boundaries blur, when a person takes responsibility for feelings, reactions, or judgments that are not theirs to carry. Peace returns when each task is returned to its rightful place. The young man recognizes how deeply this understanding has settled into him. He no longer rushes to fix disappointment that does not belong to him. He offers what is his to offer and steps back where he must. The balance is imperfect, but it feels honest. There is a conversation with his parents that unfolds differently than before. Concern is still present. Expectations still surface. But he does not argue or submit. He listens. He responds plainly. The tension remains, but it does not escalate. When the conversation ends, he feels neither victorious nor diminished. He feels aligned. Walking home, he notices the evening air, the steady movement of people around him. He feels grounded in his body, aware of each step. This presence feels more stable than approval ever did. It does not fluctuate with opinion. It does not require maintenance. The older man speaks less now when they meet. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because the young man no longer needs explanation. Silence becomes part of their conversation, carrying understanding without instruction. When the older man does speak, his words feel like confirmations rather than guidance. He speaks once more about happiness, not as something to pursue, but as something that appears when a person lives with coherence. Not excitement. Not constant satisfaction. But a quiet sense that one's actions and values are no longer in conflict. The young man understands that this coherence must be renewed continually. There will be moments when old fears return, when approval tempts him with familiar comfort. He does not expect to outgrow these moments. He expects to recognize them. His life continues to include uncertainty, conflict, and disappointment. These do not disappear. What disappears is the belief that they define him. Difficulty no longer feels like evidence of failure. It feels like participation. One evening, he sits alone again, as he has many times before. The light moves across the room. The city hums outside. Yet the stillness feels different now. It is not an absence waiting to be filled. It is a presence that feels complete. He understands that the courage to be disliked is not something he achieved. It is something he practices. Each day offers small chances to choose honesty over performance, responsibility over resentment, contribution over comparison. And in choosing this, again and again, he has discovered something quieter than happiness, but more enduring. A sense of inner grounding that does not depend on being admired, understood, or agreed with. He rests there, not finished, not resolved, but steady. And from that steadiness, life continues to unfold, ordinary and unguarded, one sincere moment at a time. There is a day when he realizes he has stopped explaining himself. Not deliberately. Not defiantly. The impulse has simply faded. When he makes a choice now, it feels complete without narration. He no longer feels the need to justify why something matters to him, or why something does not. The absence of explanation feels like a quiet form of trust. He notices this during a disagreement that once would have unsettled him deeply. The other person speaks with certainty, their expectations clear, their disappointment visible. He listens fully. He does not interrupt. When it is his turn, he responds plainly. He does not persuade. He does not retreat. The conversation ends without resolution, and he does not carry it with him afterward. Walking away, he senses something unfamiliar. There is no replay. No internal courtroom where his words are examined for flaws. The moment has passed, and he has passed with it. When he meets the older man again, the atmosphere is different. There is less tension, less urgency. The questions that once filled the space between them have softened. The older man seems to notice this and allows more silence to settle between their words. He speaks then about life not requiring justification. About how many people live as though their existence must be defended, as though they are constantly being asked to prove their right to take up space. This belief, he says, keeps people trapped in explanation, apology, and performance. To live freely is to release the need to convince. Not because others do not matter, but because one's existence does not require permission. The young man understands this without effort now. He sees how often he once apologized for reasonable needs, for limits, for preferences that harmed no one. He no longer feels pulled toward that reflex. Not because he has become indifferent, but because he has become grounded. They sit quietly for a while. The older man speaks once more, gently, about the end of chasing. Not the end of growth or curiosity, but the end of pursuing an imagined version of oneself who will finally be enough. When that chase ends, he says, a person can finally walk at their own pace. The words settle without echo. They do not inspire action. They confirm something already lived. In the days that follow, life continues with its familiar mix of effort and unpredictability. Plans fail. People misunderstand. Success comes and goes. None of it shakes him in the way it once did. He experiences disappointment without turning it into a verdict. He experiences satisfaction without clinging to it as proof. One evening, he helps someone quietly, without acknowledgement. The act is small and easily forgotten. Yet afterward, he feels a sense of alignment, a recognition that he is participating rather than performing. This feeling is steady, not euphoric. It does not ask to be noticed. As night falls, he reflects not on how much he has changed, but on how little he now resists himself. The effort once spent on managing perception has been freed. In its place is attention, presence, a willingness to meet each moment without armor. He understands now that being disliked is not a failure. It is an ordinary consequence of living sincerely among other sincere people. To fear it less is to live more openly. To accept it is to step out of the invisible trial where he once stood perpetually on defense. Outside, the world moves as it always has. Conversations unfold without him. Opinions form without consulting him. This no longer feels threatening. It feels natural. He sits with this understanding, not as an ending, but as a foundation. There is nothing left to prove. Nothing left to earn. Only the ongoing practice of living honestly, taking responsibility for his choices, and allowing others the freedom to respond as they will. And in this quiet, unremarkable practice, repeated day after day, he finds something durable. A way of living that does not depend on approval. A life that is not louder or easier, but truer.